for coming. So this is, I think, Q&A number 3, Artist Q&A number 3.
Yes.
Largely we got a question from Lord TBT over at Redwall Wiki, who was asking an obvious question, which is we've been spending a lot of time talking about the characters for the mice, and we've shown some size charts and stuff. But we wanted to talk about the rats. Obviously, that's a big deal, and I'm not quite sure how far we'll get down the road about just enemies and vermin in general. But that's kind of our topic for today. We want to talk about rats. Some of you may, I'm not sure who's on the stream, but some of you may have seen a portion of this presentation last week at CGDC, which was up in Portland. But there's some new stuff in here too. So depending on if you were there, this kind of crosses a border. So that's where we'll start. Aaron, where would you like to go?
Well, grabbing this second to do the next thing. First off, we're starting off with just like talking about rats because they are the general vermin. They are the most obvious enemy to start with.
Right.
Like we started with the mouse first because they are the most general good guy. Now we're going with the most general bad guy. One of the things I did want to talk about is we did get a question about addressing how we're defining their species in regards to good and evil, if we're having this direct dichotomy. Do you want to?
Yeah, I really want to answer that question, but I want to do it at the end.
Okay, then we'll do that at the end. I just want to make sure we touched on that since we have touched.
Yeah.
So, anyway, as kind of like we did before, when we were coming after the rats and approaching them, we did the similar thing as we did with mice. We went and looked at how a bunch of other people did them. And we looked at Secret Nim. We looked at how some other like games and other artists have approached them. We looked at Ratatouille because rats are very obvious there. Although we were fairly sure that was not the way we wanted to go with rats.
Yeah.
The thing I liked about those rats though is that they did a very good dumb rat.
Yes.
And so so it was like, okay, how did they do those kind of things with that part in particular?
Rats, I think, are an interesting critter from movies in that you see. They may be unique in that you've got movies that present them as good, like Ratatouille, and or not just movies, but movies and books and games and stuff. They present them as good guys or bad guys, and their representation will look very different. And Secret of Nim is a great example of where you actually have both. There aren't, to my knowledge, there's no bad mice in Secret of Nim, but most of the story revolves around the split in the rat community, basically the good guys and the bad guys. And Justin, who I think is this guy's name, he's a good guy, and he's depicted so much differently than I don't even remember the bad guy's name.
I haven't actually seen the movie, so I can't really help you there.
But rats seem like there's this perception of people. It feels very personal, like that rats are either disgusting little creatures, and so they ought to be treated as monsters, or they're kind of cute and furry, and they should be treated as good guys. And I don't know another creature that's like that. It's sort of like the way that we depict them in movies and stuff like that.
Nothing easily comes to mind.
Maybe predators, like lions, might be either noble or mean, but I'm not sure that's the same. But maybe you see like Simba and Scar, or Mufasa and Scar.
Yeah, that would actually be a good kind of comparison.
That could work.
In terms of how they're depicted and who's evil and who's good.
Yeah.
But a lot of that actually, I can go into how that comes across. But we can also just keep going.
Yeah, but it's fair to say in the Redwall world, rats are bad guys.
Yes.
Okay, which drives a lot of the conversation going forward.
Mm-hmm. So because they're bad guys, we can go with the more of the, if you want to do comparison with Mufasa and Scar, the more darker like colorings. The thing about if you look at Mufasa and Scar actually has this little arched nose thing going on it with a little bit of a beard. And Mufasa does not.
Right, like Mufasa, beard.
Yeah, it's a little thing he has the battle wound. It's his name. It's his name Scar. So, and Mufasa does not. Well, and also Mufasa glows because it's golden.
Yeah.
So if you just have this comparison between the two, it's just like, it's this, just even in coloring, colors betray their nature.
Musculature in them is a really interesting theme too.
That's true.
Like Scar's kind of lanky and Mufasa's muscular, and so it seems to indicate strength over, and Scar talks about this, like, you're the tough guy, I'm the smart guy, right? That's kind of how they do it. There's something on these guys, how we decided to go forward with rats. You want to talk about the monster thing?
You have a better sense of that,
okay.
So I think you should.
So with the mice and the moles and basically the woodlanders, we want the creatures, we're going to have quite a bit of influence from the real animals.
Yes.
They're not perfectly real, but there's a lot of influence there, as opposed to it being completely stylized. But with the rats, we decided that we're going to treat them as monsters as opposed to animals. And what I mean by that is that we felt that we were more free to make them exaggerated, to make them sort of non-real, that they could be a lot more fantastic in that regard. And you'll see that as we went forward, is that we just felt like we had more room to that great, and there's no reason for them to be sympathetic. And so that will decide a lot of the features and how you see this come forward.
Yeah, so as we move forward, this is like the very first concept we went for. This one, we liked it because it had that monster feel. Yeah. Although it didn't quite look like a rat, it still had that monster feel. Actually, I think the first impression was, that looks like a werewolf or a Wolverine or something like that. Yeah. It was not quite right. And what ended up happening is both me and Olivia have worked on concepts, and we have roughly 30 to 40 rat bodies, which you'll be able to see throughout this process. And just in us, because compared to the mice, we knew what we wanted for the mice and for them to look, because we had a stronger source in terms of, we knew we wanted them to be more relatable and more, and it's more of a balance between the human and then mouse. Yeah. But we're also, again, like Chris said, we were leaning into the mouse features more strongly than we are with the rats. So it was this question of how far are we going to push the rats from rat-like to monster-like, right? And that balance, instead of this rat versus human. So that was something that we had to go through. And as we're going through these ones right here were done by Olivia, and the first one obviously had that very Wolverine-esque.
Now, do you mean the superhero Wolverine or the animal?
I meant the animal, and I just realized I said the wrong thing. I meant werewolf. Okay. They both start with a W. But then we had these kind of looks too. It was really fun just going through all these iterations of rats and seeing what worked, what didn't work, and what was fun about them, what wasn't. And it was also fun seeing different approaches for myself as where I went with the rats versus where Olivia went with her rats. Yeah. Like, because she started going more with these lanky, which we both explored this lanky feel, but also this kind of, she went more with this, she started developing this hunchback look, like you see in the top left, while I started kind of going, I liked the idea of, as I've been listening to Redwall books, I've been just keep hearing about how stupid rats can be. Right. In particular. And it's like, I want to be able to have that shown if we can make that work. Yeah. But that might be, and so just there's this kind of fun difference between the two. So you can see some of my concepts here, which I definitely explored different things. And there's explorations here as well on the different sizes. Like, you see the one that's kind of triangle shape, that's an upside down triangle shape in the middle. That was we're very likely not going with this, but it's fun to look at and to figure out what that look does to the rat. Yeah, and I think you see in the kind of the center upper right, that broad shoulders thing, they felt to me a lot more wolfish, and that seemed to go wrong. But then when you wind up with the big pear shape on the one next to him, somewhere there's a balance to be had that becomes what is also recognizable as a rat. And you get down to the lower side, and I think the one on the far lower right looks ratty, but the one next to him doesn't. Right? He almost looks reptilian. And it was interesting to try to find what are the characteristics that your mind pegs on and says, okay, that's a vermin. Yeah. So these are like all of the concepts just on the sketch side. One of the things that we decided to move forward with in terms of this was, and it was going to be something that we used to figure out what we wanted, was we actually turned them all to just straight silhouettes. So we had none of those features and to figure out what we looked at. And one of the things that I noticed was like, oh, some of the rat concepts just look like taller mice now. Yeah. And that was okay, so we can't go with that concept because we need to distinguish them from the mice. Yeah, the silhouette step I thought was particularly revealing in the same way that you just said, is things that looked good with details didn't work once you kind of went silhouette, and that was an interesting reductive step. Yeah, it was also fun because it made it we were able to identify features that we did like we figure out, we really like it, like how the rat has the sloping hunchback, we wanted them to be lazy looking, right, or just have that hunchback look like we have, I believe, on in the white one, if you see number 12 versus number 8. I'm not sure you guys can read the numbers. But those two were this having the rat leaning so much more than the mouse does. It gives it a different feel. And we also, one of the other things we looked at, which we discussed a lot in previous talks, about how the mouse, we wanted them to have this balance of how they walked and how we had their feet with heel down, because it made them feel so much more relaxed, and they felt too aggressive when they're on their toes. Well, with rats, that's exactly what we want, so we have them on their toes so much more. Yeah. And they can still, and that's where their relaxed state would be, is them aggressively on their toes. And so it was this fun step of going through all of these things, and it was also it was just a really fun process.
Yeah. I'm sure someone will eventually ask a question, and we'll answer the same way we did with the mice. While this was a process to find sort of like a single rat, there's a high likelihood that you'll see several of these shapes and designs in the final game, because we started to see how much characteristics they spoke to. So you have little 19...
I'm going to the actual guy.
Okay.
This one on the right.
So this like chubby guy right down here, like he has such a great character to him. It would be a shame to not see him. Mm-hmm. But we didn't want all the rats to be this kind of portly, tubby rat. But he could be great, say, for Cheese Thief or something like this, as a standout character that needs to look differently and have that character to him.
Yep. And it's something that it's awesome. Yeah. And so going back forward, after we did silhouettes, we figured out which looks we wanted to identify with, and we liked the Hunchback. We liked the eggs of the 13 silhouette and how the head structures were, and then kind of getting this balance between just sloping versus actual Hunchback. And then to the left there, you see what we have as our current size chart. But here's, if everything's measured in mice, we're wanting the average rat to be 1.5 mice tall. Mices. Right. Mices tall. I know it's only 1.5. Is that actually mices or is that mice?
Maybe that's like fractional mices. I'm not sure. So anybody who's been watching us on Facebook, this is obviously a piece of a larger size chart. And it's fascinating how much difference of opinion has been on this. Like, we could probably do a whole Q&A on the size chart. But it's striking to notice in people's minds how each creator wound up in their heads, who was big, who was small. And then some folks imagine these guys to be roughly animal size, like pretty small lifestyle. Other people imagine them to be human size and everything in between. And so it's really compelling to watch people process these thoughts. Like, how does this fit? What is, how much bigger is a badger? Is it 20 mice, which, is even probably still small for real life? Like, probably a badger's probably like 100x of a real mouse. But that's not in their mind. So that is a whole fascinating conversation. But I will tell you, in general, and for reasons that we can go into later, we have compressed our size chart compared to some other folks, in that we didn't want any creature to be so bigger than any other creature that it was just sort of that they weren't in the same world.
I think some of the few exceptions to that could be particular birds, like birds of prey.
Right.
Could go outside of that. Another example would be snakes. I remember talking with someone, I can't remember if this was during our talk or another different space, but we're probably going to be measuring our snakes in terms of the size of their heads, not in terms of the size of their bodies, because their bodies obviously need to be very long.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And so it was just like how we're measuring, and also with birds of prey and with snakes in particular, they aren't as common. Like, there's usually one or two, one of them at least in each book, but there's only usually one singular. There's not multiple, except for actually a couple of them. There are multiples, but.
And then I think, tell me if I'm wrong here, I think right now the badger is the biggest critter on our chart.
Yes.
I believe when we get there, maybe the wolverine could be a little bit bigger, but that's a rare case.
Yeah.
So if the badger's the biggest, and tell me if I'm remembering this right, our badger is 3 mices?
Yes. Okay,
so that gives you kind of the, there are creatures smaller than the mice, but I think the upper boundary for realistic purposes is the badger is at 3 mices.
Our largest woodlander is the badger at 3 mices, and the largest vermin right now is the fox at 2.5.
Okay.
Because we wanted the badger to be the biggest compared to anything else, and so the next biggest in terms of the general vermin was going to be the fox.
Right on. Wildcats, we can go into that later.
Wildcats are their own. I think I categorize them as the same thing as birds of prey. They're kind of one-offs. Not always, but they're like they're going to be more approached, I think, on the individual's typical thing. Versus you can find foxes as a part of the general hordes of rats and just rats and stoats and weasels and foxes. When they're talking about the legions of the vermin, they get included, and cats do not.
Okay.
So that's my kind of categorization in terms of the differences and why we don't have a cat on that scale right now.
Right on.
And so, getting back to our rat sizes, is we were comparing these two, and from here, we went ahead and Olivia did an absolutely fantastic job and has given us this current rat model. And it was really fun seeing this because she went the extra mile and put in like a little bit muscular muscle tone, which compared to the mouse doesn't have that, but it makes the mouse feel much more approachable and friendly. Yeah. And it gives that aggressive feel to this rat.
And heroic, right? Which I really
like. Yeah, it was really heroic too.
So something that's come out is that one of the things that we liked about this particular rat design is that the hunchback, the sort of posture of the guy, it makes him feel always a little bit off balance. He's kind of always leaning into you. I think it also helped, like going back to that, like he's a monster, like he's the hunchback of the rat world or whatever, and we think that can become a silhouette and an object that is easily identifiable and also easily distinguishable from other vermin and other things. So that you can see sort of a shape in this, and while arguably there's a certain serpentine aspect to him, you'll see that even more in the ermines, in the weasels and stoats, and that kind of stuff.
They have even more neck to work with.
Right now we have these guys with sort of disproportionate limbs and bodies, and so from like a human perspective, his arms seem too long, his legs are kind of funky, like he will walk in a clumsy sort of way, so you would imagine him being stronger. And probably very shortly we'll have a walk cycle that we can share too. We didn't have it quite ready for this, so it's not in here. But yeah, I love the way that this just showed up. Can't wait to get some fur on it.
Yes, that had to happen after this process, which also is what had to happen. It's called retopo, I think. Retopo.
Yeah.
Retopo. I cannot say the word.
I don't know. I can't.
Anyway, it's an animation term, animation/modeling term, which means cleaning up the whole thing, which had to happen before fur could be added and before rigging and animation could happen. Yeah. So we decided to finalize the model before, instead of going into animation and having a subpar model to show.
Right, agreed.
So we have this, and then we already showed you the size chart, and this is what our current one is, which is because of the size we had to actually. Okay, where's my mouse? I can't remember. I think this is how I get to it. Is it going to show? No, it did not.
What was it doing?
This is the YouTube video.
No, I know. What was the next slide? Oh, I see. Okay. Should I use the mouse?
Maybe, yeah. Grabbing the mouse.
Mouse.
Grabbing the mouse so I can show you the mouse and fun cycle this way. I love this because we just do loops, and actually that's so much easier. Anyway, so we're showing you this kind of like, okay, here is the rat to mouse sizing with our current models, and it was really fun seeing this because it's a completely different feel.
Right.
Like we already mentioned how the way they're standing is this piece, like this kind of more relaxed versus aggressive feeling. Having the head right on, like upright versus completely leaning over.
Yeah.
And then that musculature versus the softness.
It's a big difference.
It's a huge difference, and there's this difference in angle, and also with the articulation that went into the hands on the rat. Really helps make them feel sharp and dangerous.
Cranky old critters.
Cranky is great.
Little detail. I think this is the first time they've seen whiskers. So
yes.
That's a new feature that wasn't in the last presentation.
Yes, and actually that's another thing I was finding fun is that the rats have these short whiskers that are just right there immediately. They don't go out too far versus the mice that do. So they have these long bouncy. They're going to be bouncy whiskers because whiskers are going to be able to do that, and it's really fun seeing that.
So before you go to the next slide, there's like Emily, do we have any questions that we need to answer, or should we proceed? Is Emily listening? Do we have any questions in the thread that we should answer? Or...
We have lots of questions.
All right, throw some out. Let's hear what we got.
Okay, so...
By the way, do you want to get on camera so they can see you?
Alright.
Okay.
Okay.
This is our silent Emily.
So not exactly silent. She's just not visible. She's our invisible Emily.
My bad.
Invisible Emily. Now you talk.
We have lots of questions on the rats of whether all of them will be vermin. There's several who were pressed into Queen's Horde that were like rat farmers. And there are some, but few villains or villain species that are actually good. So will they all be bad, or will there be some good?
So I think this kind of deepens to the question you started. Also, it's kind of like some folks have talked about Redwall as if it's kind of racist. The notion like all rats are bad, right? Is sort of this racist comment. I think, and I'm not quite sure that this was a quote from Brian Jakes, but I'm pretty sure that he was part of the conversation. And the notion is people aren't evil because they're rats. They're rats because they're evil. In other words, the way that it was explained was that the species was a reflection of their character, not the other way around. And I really like that answer. Mm-hmm. And I also think that Redwall falls into the category basically of low fantasy, where good and evil are real categories. It's not all gray area like you get in different worlds. Like I never have to worry about whether or not there's a good orc. Orcs are bad. And in this world, I believe that the setup is such that their species generally reflects their nature. Whether or not, with regard to the rats who may have been farmers, I think lots of people would say that the first book did some things that none of the other books did. And to my knowledge, that was a one-off case. And that's not to say that we ignore it, but we have to treat it as an anomaly, not as normal.
There was a rat in the book of the Bell Tower who was actually a good rat.
A good rat? Okay. So we know it happens,
Yeah.
but it's pretty darn rare. Mm-hmm. So I would say like we're certainly willing and able to explore that category, but it's got to be seen as abnormal. Like that's not the way it typically is.
I think the only vermin that is one that we're approaching as a true neutral is the stoats.
Right.
Because those are the only. They're usually categorized as vermin, but they are actually more true neutrals. And then foxes they are vermin, but they are more self-serving versus serving everyone.
It seems to be the deal.
If there is a mouse that turns evil, does it turn into a rat?
That's a great question, and we don't see that. That would feel like a magical effect, and so we don't do that. I think it's a Tagarrug is where the otter gets raised by the vermin, but he's just too good in spirit, so he can't. I think it's that one. So it's somewhere in here we got to figure this out. I will say I don't make any absolute statements because the truth is it's a really fun world, and I think the ability for freedom and flexibility has got to be part of how we play it. So nothing should be seen as set in stone.
Will any of the women characters be playable, such as being one of the rat farmers that got pressed into Queen's
Right now, no. And this is more a scope question than anything else. Is that we just got to we only got time to do certain things. So right now we are not having rats or other vermin playable characters.
Are you planning on having any birds? There are several birds.
There will be birds. We won't get to them right away.
And how big will they be compared to mice?
So the sparrow, I believe, if I remember correctly, they're kind of compared to being the size of mice. At least the general one. I believe the queen. I cannot remember her name.
Queen Crazy Pants.
Queen Crazy Pants works. But she is, I believe, compared actually even in the books as being roughly the size of Matthias.
It seems like that's about right.
And sure, there's other bigger ones, some other smaller ones, but that's kind of going into there's a variation in body type, and so the general size of sparrow specifically can be assumed since they are not categorized in that birds of prey in that special category that I have personally. But I would say that they would be mouse size.
Yeah.
Crows, I know that there's, I believe it's in Madame Mayo that crows show up. A lot. There's just the bird occupation of Redwall in that book, and I would probably put the general crows as being more on the rat size, or maybe slightly bigger than rats, because I would put them as the equivalent of rats. To just that they're still birds.
We need Captain Snow. Captain Snow will be large, so
I would put him as
Maybe badger size.
Yeah, I put mine as badger size. He's an owl, correct?
Mhm.
Yeah, I would put mine as badger size. He's a bird of prey.
Yeah.
Someone asked if is it in the books that even humans feared Clooney? Will there be humans in the storyline?
No, there's no humans, and this goes back to where Redwall, the first book, seems to be an outlier, and the consensus we get from the community is that there's just things in that book that we have to kind of ignore. Otherwise, it throws everything else off. So there won't be humans, and we're going to pretend that never happened.
So will all or most rats look like this model? And how much variety will there be?
You know, I was really impressed with Shadow of Mordor in the way that they have so much variation in the orcs. It makes that whole species come to life. So I would say I would love to have a lot of variation in rats, but it's likely to be the kind of thing that we do iteratively. So in the first game, actually, you'll see, I don't know, I mean, I'm just picking a number, but you'll see multiple kinds of rats, but we'll likely keep growing on that because we want variation, and not just in rats, but in all the species.
Yeah, I would suspect, maybe depending on scope and how much on the technical side it would be for memory and stuff like that, from having that, depending on how many like models we'd have to make, it could be maybe limited to maybe just 3 to 5 variations.
We'll just see how much time.
But it's more about how much time we have to put into it, but we want there to be variation.
That said, like the next section that we do here is going to be about clothing, and we expect clothing to create a lot of variation, more than the models.
Yeah. And so, do we have any more questions or?
One last question. What about the horse?
What horse, right? Exactly. So that is on that list of like, let's pretend this never happened, because it creates all kinds of questions that we don't want. And there's a dozen of them. So, well, more than a dozen. So, yes, there's a horse, and we're going to have to kind of punt on that. I'm not sure how. So, that's the short answer.
Okay.
Thank you. So those were our questions. Keep them coming because we're going to do another segment here. We'll see how it takes. We're going to talk about clothing on the vermin.
Yep. So similar process as we went with rats. We didn't know exactly how we wanted to portray them. And is this working? Let's just do this. Pause that, and there we go. So in a similar sense, me and Olivia both did our own variations of clothing. We both have like these solid, strong concepts, and one of the fun parts that we were going through was the explore them as pirates, explore them as land dwelling, specific land dwelling kind of bandit looks. We explored armor pieces. There's some interesting Asian influences that came into it.
Yeah, and that center, they almost look like samurai or something.
Yeah, specifically like that 15B looks like this really fun archer.
Yep.
Look, it is just these fun kind of like ideas, and where we started off with, but then one of the things that was interesting to look at is we looked at all of these, and it was like, well, then we had to have the conversation of what does clothing indicate? Because we mentioned it before, like, is clothing about covering up because of modesty? Or is clothing like a status thing, or is it about keeping warm? And what it came down to is we wanted clothing to be an indicator of status / location, and also like obviously during the winter they're going to be wearing more clothing because it's cold.
Right.
It does snow in the Mossflower region.
And the idea that clothing was sort of like station or context specific, as opposed to being species specific.
Yes.
It gave us, frankly, a lot more opportunity. So for example, if all of the creatures on Clooney's pirate ship dress like pirates, regardless of their species, that gives us a lot of freedom. And then similarly, whenever we have other groups of enemies, they will dress according to where they're from, what they're doing, who they're about, not wolf, rat, weasel.
There are some species specific styling, like, but we wanted to have it be more based on location. Like, for example, all the critters who are part of the order of Redwall are moving like habits.
Right.
But not all of them are just mice, and not all of the mice there are of the order.
Right.
So they're not all going to be wearing those things. And so it's just this kind of balance between it. A lot of the design part comes down to balance between multiple things.
Yeah, and you want to not close off doors that you want to open later. So you'll see several designs here that almost look, you could call them land dwellers. They're kind of almost like I don't know, hillbillies, right? Kind
Yeah.
of like mountain people. And I think as a look and as a style, that really works. It'd be great. We chose in this case to focus on the pirate look, but that was because of the Clooney and the sea rats being the key enemy.
Yes, especially in our current scope of what we're looking at.
Right.
And so we ended up focusing. I'm going to use this one because I think it's working better. So we focused on these concepts here. Took these concepts that we liked because they looked more piratey. 3 up on the top right. Well, we liked that one. It felt too heroic.
Yeah, he's kind of swashbuckling, Errol Flynn like. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like, yes, looks like a pirate, or not pirate, but just like looks like he belongs on a ship, but not a rat ship.
Right.
Like the open shirt with the big long like sleeves are just like, yeah, not gonna work for this.
But see, he would be great for a character. I can't remember the guy's name, but Virago the assassin has his sort of like handsome son, who's also bad, but he's charming. And so that kind of feel would be great for that guy.
Yeah.
My personal favorite is probably number 7 below. It's like I don't know, kind of a Mr. Smee look to it, but I just really like that look of the outfit. And there was a variation of that where he had these striped pants, which I thought was a lot of fun. But anyways,
You can kind of see the striped pants on number 5.
Yeah.
A little bit underneath it because it kind of pokes out.
they were just a lot of fun with these guys.
And so I think my personal favorite is actually 4. Really like that jacket.
Yeah.
And I think that specifically, I really like how the collar fits it. It just looks really cool to me.
Those collar things, and especially like the big cuffs of the pirate things, they create points on the both the look and on the silhouette that to me were really distinctive. So you've got the tricorn hats, you've got the points on the coat. Basically, they create these acute angles everywhere you look, which I thought was really effective.
Yes, it makes them feel sharper, more aggressive because sharpness does that versus roundness. So we took these concepts, and Olivia, being the amazing artist she is, took them and created this model for us. In which she took that, I think she was mostly deriving from that top left one,
Right.
the top left model, and added close to to that rat model. And there's a little bit of the cuff in there. It has an eye covered, which actually I find interesting about that is I think that it's actually that's just purely hanging off. I can't quite tell. No, actually, no, it does go underneath.
It covers it. Yeah.
It hangs off from behind the ear, but also does have a little bit of collar,
Okay,
like wrap around. That's where the word is like, does it actually tie off? Yeah, it does. Okay, but I like that the vest is a little too small for it. And also the fun part about this is that while the rat is like the original just naked rat looks really aggressive, in part because of all the musculature, adding the clothes actually kind of gets that it kind of decreases it a little bit, but not in a bad way.
Yeah.
It doesn't make them feel over aggressive. It also, and part of it's because it also makes them feel and I guess part of it is that it stylizes them in a way that I feel is a benefit.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this model. It makes me think of Captain Jack. There's just the sash and the dangling thing off his hair. This is a fun piece. I liked it. It starts opening the conversation we started before about shoes.
Yes.
And so you see some wraps along his legs. And right now, probably rats will remain barefoot, especially pirate rats.
Yeah.
But we still got to figure out the shoes on the Woodlanders. It's a weird problem to deal with.
I think the way we're going to approach shoes in general is they are like a very specific status-oriented thing. They're not actually about keeping your feet covered or like protected from the elements, because especially because with Woodlanders, we're keeping them more towards the animal realism of the source, and their feet are meant for they grip, they balance in a way that human feet don't.
That's true. Yeah.
And so, for us, it is more important to have the protection as a human, but for them, they already have that thick padding, so much thicker padding on their feet, that it just makes it so much easier to maybe have it not be as big of a deal. But there was a very specific, although it is first book, so we could potentially ignore it.
That's a good point. Pretend that never happened.
Pretend that never happened, that the Redwall or the Redwallers have sandals as part of the order, because it was very specifically pointed out, I think 3 times in the first couple chapters, that Matthias's sandals are too big for his feet, and he kept tripping over them. Makes it very comical, but it's still kind of
How did you feel about the process of making the rat compared to the mouse?
It was a lot quicker than it was for the mouse. But I think part of that is with the mouse, we had to figure out so much more that would influence rats, influence stoats, influence squirrels. It influences all the other species.
I would agree. It felt like the mouse became our point of reference for every other conversation. Mm-hmm. And once and it was hard to think it through, but once we did, this went a lot faster.
Oh yeah.
But I liked also creating a villain allowed for kind of broadening our perspective in an interesting direction. So it was fun.
It was covering the good side and then the bad side. It was here's kind of our basis for this, since the major conflict in that first book is between the mouse and the rat.
Yeah.
And it's always just an intriguing thing and stuff.
So just to be clear, like, this isn't Clooney. This is just a rat.
Clooney actually will be one of those normal rats, where he's going to be sized, I believe, at 2 mice tall. Because he's a big rat. Yeah. And then there's also some other rats that are very specifically bigger than other ones, like rat, because they're so big that they, I don't know, anyway.
Yeah.
And so Clooney will have his specific clothing. His tail will be, I think, maybe not much longer, but it'll still be obviously longer than other rats. And part of that might be even like a false extension because of the blade he has attached to it. But I should have included it in this, but Jeremy ended up doing an illustration of Clooney, which wasn't just as here's how he could look in this style, but it was still really cool to see it. And see how this variation looked, and it was just like, well, how then would we apply that look to this style of model, or how would we change this model to fit that look, but still keeping with the same thematic features?
Yeah.
So.
Is this the end of the presentation?
I think we have just one more slide, but that's just the size chart. So yes, I believe we're at the end.
Okay. Then Emily, do we have any other questions we need to deal with?
We do.
Okay.
So this question is, how do you plan to do sword dueling and such? Only the Long Patrol is really trained, but the vermin probably know how to use a sword.
I'm going to not answer that question yet, because I want to answer that basically there's a much broader conversation about combat that I want to have later, and so I don't want to answer that sort of like off my cuff.
Okay. That's it.
That's it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, I think the one thing that we did have to think about in regards to just combat in general was when we decided about how we were dealing with shoulders.
Yeah.
That influenced when we were doing the concepts for the mice. It was, well, if we give them a human shoulder, it makes it easier to deal with any potential combat animations we have to do. But because we've created a different anatomy structure for them, which influences all other critters, it changes how we then get to tackle animations, because they can't reach and they don't have the same range as we do.
Right.
So they can't do some of the same moves that a human might. So it was just this kind of, how are we going to balance this thing? So that's something that we have thought about, just haven't gotten to a conclusive piece.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming, and this has been a lot of fun. It continues to be a lot of fun. So thank you to Emily and Keenan and everyone who helped. Aaron, thank you very much for all your guidance, and Olivia. Olivia apparently is moving on, and we're going to be missing her, but we want to wish her fair winds and following seas, and whatever her adventure is, or just stay. That'd be great too. So there you go, and thank you again. We will see you next time.